Your grandmother's freezer was always full. Her pantry held more than anyone in that house was ever going to eat, and she would not let you throw food away. Any food. You probably filed that under thrift, or worry, or just how old people are. It was a war. For 4 years, there was a small paper book on her kitchen counter, issued in her name. It decided what she was allowed to eat. Not what she could afford, what she was allowed. No sugar without it, no coffee, no meat, no butter, no cheese. The stamps ran out, and the family went without. And this war didn't stop at what came into her kitchen. It wanted what was left over. The bacon grease in the can beside her stove went back out the door. Rendered fat gives up glycerin. Glycerin goes into explosives. Sunday breakfast came back as ammunition. That kitchen was a supply line. The book was gone before she was 30. What it built in her never left. And some of it is in your kitchen tonight. 3 things to understand. 1. How fast the government took control of the American plate. 2. What she actually did at that stove when the meat stopped coming. 3. Why this war kept running in her kitchen for 50 years after it ended. Start with your refrigerator. The butter. The margarine sitting next to it. One of those two is in there because of this war. The first thing this country took off her table was not meat. It wasn't bread either. It was sugar. The lanes that carried cane from the Philippines and the Caribbean had become war zones. Sugar didn't run out. It stopped arriving. And the way they handed out the books tells you how total this was going to be. In May of 1942, families lined up to be registered at their children's schools. Teachers wrote down how many people lived in each house at the same desks where those kids did their arithmetic. Think about what that meant in a country that had just spent a decade being told to buy more, eat more, spend more. Overnight, money stopped being enough. You could have a full wallet and an empty plate. Coffee followed that November. Then the system got serious. In 1943, the government moved to something called point rationing. Every rationed food carried a point value. Red points covered meat, fish, and dairy, 64 a month. Blue points covered canned and bottled goods, 48. And the values kept changing. So picture the woman running that household. She is standing at a butcher counter doing arithmetic in her head. This cut against that cut, this many red points left, 11 days until the next book. Get it wrong, and the last week of the month has no meat in it. She wasn't shopping, she was rationing a family. And nobody had trained her for it. And the book itself was not a coupon. It was a legal document issued to a person. Every member of that household had one, including the baby, who couldn't chew anything yet but still counted, and whose stamps helped feed everyone else. Which means the arithmetic of that family sat written down in a drawer. 6 books meant 6 allowances. 5 books meant somebody was gone. And that was not a figure of speech. Printed on the book itself was a line telling her exactly what to do about it. In the event of death, the book must be surrendered. So in the middle of grief, someone in that house had to go to the drawer, find the book with that name on it, and hand it back to the government. Then come home to a kitchen that now held less. The war reached all the way into that drawer, and the stamps inside it were the only ones she had. A book left on a counter or dropped in the street didn't mean an errand to redo. It meant a month her family still had to get through. So the book got a place. A tin, a drawer, the same shelf every single day checked before bed. Ask an older American why there's one drawer in the house where the important things live and where nothing is ever allowed to move. It started somewhere. This is the first thing to understand about your grandmother and food. For 4 years, a mistake in the kitchen was not an inconvenience. It was a week of going without. So she had to become something nobody had asked her to be. And what she did about it is the part that never washed out of her. Her first move was to stop depending on the store at all. The government asked Americans to grow their own vegetables. What happened next is hard to picture now. 20 million victory gardens. Backyards, vacant lots, window boxes, strips of dirt beside factories. And by 1944, those gardens were growing about 40% of all the fresh vegetables eaten in this country. Sit with that number for a second. Nearly half the fresh food on American tables was not coming from a farm or a store or a truck. It was coming from ordinary people in dirt they turned over themselves. That is not a hobby. That is a country feeding itself with its own hands. And that can of grease beside her stove? I left something out. She wasn't donating it. She carried that fat to the butcher, and the butcher paid her for it. 4 cents a pound. And once butter and lard went onto the ration list, they added 2 ration points per pound on top of the cash. The government had done the math. Guilt alone was never going to fill those cans. So think about what 4 years of that does to a person. The thing every other household pours down the drain is in her kitchen worth money, worth points, and worth something to the war. And it worked. Between 1942 and 1945, American kitchens turned in 537 million pounds of used cooking fat. 500 million pounds of it, scraped out of frying pans, one supper at a time. That is why she never poured it out. Not in 1943, not in 1983 either. And butter went to the troops. What stayed behind was margarine. And the story of what it looked like tells you everything about this era. Margarine is naturally white. Decades earlier, the dairy industry had gotten Congress to tax the yellow kind at 40 times the rate of the white, so what reached her kitchen in wartime was a pale block the color of lard. It came with a small capsule of yellow dye, and somebody in that house, usually a child, had to squeeze and knead the color through the whole block by hand until it passed for butter. An entire generation of American children have that memory in their hands. Squeezing a bag of white grease into something that looked like the thing they used to have. And the cooking itself changed shape. When meat is measured in points, meat stops being the center of the plate and starts being a flavor spread across it. A little chopped and stretched through noodles. A bone doing the work of a roast. Whatever was left going into a dish with a crust on top, so it looked like a meal instead of leftovers. That's the casserole. Not a recipe, a survival strategy with a lid on it. But there was a second door out of the meat problem. And if you are old enough, you already know what it tastes like. The point system was built around what the Army wanted. The Army wanted steaks, chops, and roasts. The Army did not want liver. So liver stayed cheap. Kidney, heart, tongue, brains, oxtail. Cuts a lot of American families had walked past for a generation were suddenly the only meat you could buy without spending a stamp on it. And the government pushed hard. Organ meat got a friendlier name for the campaign. They called it variety meat. So that is where it comes from. Liver and onions on a Thursday. Tongue in the icebox. Chicken hearts. Beef heart, stuffed and roasted like a small bird. If you were raised by that generation, you were fed this. And you probably hated it. And you probably could not understand why she kept making it, and why she got so quiet when you pushed the plate away. She wasn't being difficult. She was cooking the meat that once didn't cost her a stamp. And then there was the can. Spam. And the other tinned meats like it were never rationed. No points, no counting, no gamble at the butcher counter. Slice it, fry it, put it in front of 4 people. Done. That is how a can of pressed pork ended up in the pantry of nearly every family in America, and stayed there for another 40 years, long after anyone had to. Desserts got the same treatment. Sugar was tight, butter was gone, eggs were unreliable. So she baked cakes with none of the 3, sweetened with boiled fruit and darkened with spice, and put one on the table anyway. Because a table with something sweet on it still felt like a home, and that mattered more than the recipe did. And then there was the jar. Everything that garden produced arrived at once, in August, far more than anyone could eat that week. So the second half of every growing season was spent putting it into glass. Tomatoes, beans, peaches, pickles, jars boiling on a stove in a kitchen with no air conditioning, in the hottest month of the year, for days at a time. Whole towns ran shared canning centers because there were never enough pressure canners to go around. Neighbors took turns, women taught each other, and when it was done, she had a wall of full jars, a winter she could see. Remember that image. We're going to come back to it. But I've made this sound more noble than it was. Because there was another way to get meat, and plenty of Americans took it. A butcher who'd sell you a cut without asking for points. A back room. A price with no ceiling on it. Meat became one of the most heavily black-marketed goods in the country, and it was not organized crime doing most of it. It was ordinary shops and ordinary customers quietly agreeing not to mention it. So every trip to the store carried a small moral question. Do you feed your family better tonight, or do you hold the line for people you'll never meet? Some said yes, some said never. And the ones who said never held on to that for the rest of their lives. Because in that kitchen, being careful with food had stopped being economics. It had become character. And she was doing all of this with less time than any woman in her family ever had. Close to 7 million American women went into war work in these years. Plants, shipyards, offices, which meant the person doing the point arithmetic, the garden, the canning, and the grease can was very often doing all of it after a shift. Stores closed before she got out. Ration points expired on a schedule that didn't care about her hours. Dinner still had to be on the table. That is the exact pressure that would later make an entire industry rich. A tired, working American woman with a family to feed and no hours left in the day. The post-war food business would spend the next 20 years selling to that woman. The war built the customer first. And by now you've almost certainly done what everyone does with this story. Counting points, coloring margarine, saving grease in a can. You've assumed America was running out of food. It wasn't. Not the way you're picturing it. There was no famine in this country. For 4 years, America fed itself, fed an army of millions, and shipped food across 2 oceans to allies whose own farmland had become battlefield. All at the same time. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part people get wrong about their own grandmothers. It does not mean she was going without for nothing. It means the opposite. A famine takes from you. Nobody chooses it, and nobody gets credit for surviving it. This was different. What came off her table was not lost. It was sent to a 19-year-old in a transport ship and to a family in Europe she would never meet and never hear from. She wasn't a victim of a shortage. She was the supply line. And she knew it every time she handed over a stamp. The squeeze was real, but it came from somewhere else. Farmhands were drafted or left for factory wages. Rail cars that used to carry produce were carrying troops and steel. And the best of it was going overseas. But there's one more reason, and it's the one that surprises people most. Americans suddenly had money. The Depression was over. The plants were running around the clock, and for the first time in 15 years, ordinary families had real wages in their pockets. People who had gone 10 years without a steak could finally afford a steak. All of them. At once. So this country faced a problem that had nothing to do with empty fields. More money chasing less food. And without rationing, that has exactly one ending. Prices climb until the people at the top eat well and everybody else stands at the window. So the government took money out of the equation on purpose. A stamp is not a dollar. It cannot be earned, and it cannot be outbid. A rich family and a poor family in the same town walked out of that store with the same allowance. And that had an effect almost nobody expects. For a lot of working families, people who had just come through the Depression with too little of everything, these were the years the food supply finally became steady. Not generous, steady. And after the 30s, steady was the thing they had been missing. And then the war ended. Rationing came off, item by item. Sugar was the last to go, and it held on until 1947, well after the shooting stopped, which should have been the end of all of it. The books burned, the gardens dug under, the can by the stove finally thrown out. That is not what happened. Because American industry now had a problem it had never had before. It had spent 4 years, with the government's help, training an entire population to save everything. Reuse the fat, stretch the meat, grow it yourself, waste nothing. Now the factories were converting back to peacetime. The stores were filling up again, and all that new production needed somebody to buy it. So the country went to work in the other direction. Advertising, magazines, the whole post-war machine, teaching Americans a new lesson. You've earned it. Buy the roast, buy the freezer, buy the convenience. And it worked. On the young, on the ones who came after. It never fully worked on her, because you cannot unteach 4 years of that. Not to someone who did the arithmetic at the butcher counter and got it wrong once and watched what that cost. So she kept the coffee can by the stove long after anyone needed the grease. She washed and folded aluminum foil. She kept the garden going in a decade when vegetables were cheap and everywhere. She put the heel of the loaf back in the bag instead of the bin. And the jars. Remember the wall of jars. She kept filling it. Through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, decades when the supermarket 2 miles away had all of it, cheaper, year-round, and nobody needed a cellar full of peaches. She filled it anyway. Because that wall was never really about peaches. It was about being able to look at winter and know the answer. And she had learned, at an age when it goes in deepest, that the answer is not something you assume. It's something you put up in August. That's the freezer that was always full. That's the pantry with more in it than anyone will eat. It isn't hoarding. It's a woman who once counted stamps, making sure it never comes down to counting again. And if you grew up around her, you probably thought some of it was strange. Thrift or stubbornness or just an old woman's habit. It was none of those. It was training. It was the muscle memory of a woman who had been personally responsible for whether her family ate that week, with a government book on the counter telling her how far she was allowed to go. That's what rationing really did. It didn't just change a menu for 4 years. It rewired one generation's entire relationship with food, and then that generation cooked for the next one, and taught it without ever explaining why. The casserole at the funeral, the refusal to throw out a half cup of anything, the pantry with more in it than anyone will eat, the plate you are not allowed to leave food on. None of that is nostalgia. It's an inheritance, handed down through the hands that lived it. So go look in your own kitchen tonight. The saved container, the full freezer, the thing you do with food that you've never really questioned. Somebody taught you that. And somebody taught them in a year when the book on the counter said no. So tell me, what did your grandmother do with food that you never understood until now?